Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. My name's Killian Garvey. I'm a barrister from King's Chambers. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to be talking about the proposed changes to the NPPF. I entitled this talk, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and I very, very nearly came on to screen with a cowboy hat on, but my partner said I looked rather daft. In fact, she was more impolite than that, but rest assured, she told me I shouldn't be wearing it. So I'm not going to be. But the purpose of the talk is really to go through the government's proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. I want to make it as interactive as we can. It looks like we've got 800 people on the call. So what I'd suggest is if you've got a question, there's a chat function. So please, if you want to go through the chat function, and equally, I think that there's the opportunity to raise hands. So again, if you want to raise your hand as we go, I can respond to questions as we go. But obviously, there's 800 of us, so I'll do my best answering questions. And at the very end, I'll be doing a Q&A as well. So on the 22nd of December, the government published their version of the NPPF, the draft proposed changes. It's a tracked change document. They're in the middle of a consultation exercise, which is intended to proceed until the 2nd of March. And they provide the opportunity for anyone to make their observations about the proposed changes. The consultation is both on the NPPF and also the intention of having national development management policies. So it's not just the NPPF, and they acknowledge, the government, that this is a precursor to further changes when the Levelling Up Bill comes into law. The headlines for the new NPPF is that the changes are more tweaks as opposed to wholesale revisions. They are largely related to housing development. They critically, someone's asked the question, will slides be notes circulated following this? There won't be slides, but this recording, it will be recorded, and you'll be able to get a copy of the recording probably from about tomorrow. So the NPPF, it's proposed to provide huge incentives on local authorities. Oh, do we have to mute ourselves, or are we muted? Don't worry, I think you are muted. So the NPPF provides incentives on local authorities to get development plans submitted and adopted. That's the real headline, that if the local planning authorities can get a development plan in place, it will significantly reduce the scope for developers, arguing that the presumption in favour of sustainable development, i.e. the tilted planning balance, is engaged. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. I'm actually going to go through the proposed changes to the NPPF and go through them sort of paragraph by paragraph, because there aren't actually that many. So it's actually, we can do it in this way. We're going to be, I should say, some of the changes that are proposed are largely inconsequential. So, for example, paragraph 1 tells us that the government, that the NPPF, it should provides a framework within which locally prepared plans can provide for sufficient housing and other development in a sustainable manner. Preparing and maintaining up-to-date plans should be seen as a priority in meeting this objective. I don't think anything that's said there is controversial or hugely changes things. In fact, in reality, some of these changes, this being one of them, is in reality inconsequential. I don't think it's going to make a change to how anyone's approaching local plans or development management decisions. But then, and similarly, paragraph 7, that the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, including the provision of homes and other forms of development. Again, largely inconsequential change, but we get to the changes to the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And we'll have to spend some time on this, because the changes that are proposed for both plan making and decision taking are very significant in terms of the actual consequences of how this will be applied going forward. So in terms of plan making, the government, and some of these paragraphs need to be read in tandem with paragraphs later on in the NPPF, which we'll look at in a moment. But in terms of plan making, the government says that strategic policies should, as a minimum, provide for objectively assessed need for housing, unless The application of policies in a frame that protect areas or assets of particular importance provides a strong reason for restricting the overall scale, type, or distribution development in the plan area. Okay, that's the same as it currently is. And then it introduces the tilted balance. The impacts would significantly demonstrate outweigh the benefits. Such adverse impacts may include situations where meeting need in full would mean building at densities significantly out of character with the existing area. That is a cue, and the footnote tells us that design codes will provide the answer as to what are densities that are significantly out of character. Now, that, to my mind, is a curious addition. And what I'm not going to be doing in this talk is giving views as to whether I think these changes are for good or right or wrong, whether they're good, bad, or ugly. I'm going to be talking about them as a lawyer and trying to understand what are the actual practical implications of how this is going to play out. And this clause I find to be a little bit odd. And the reason I say that is because local authorities might say, well, we can't meet our objectively assessed need because to do so would mean we'd have to be too dense in our schemes. And we can demonstrate that because on our allocations, they're maxed out. We've reached densities on our existing allocations that we're proposing that are too great. So you can't get any more housing on them. To which the developer response would naturally be, well, the answer to that is you need more allocations. And again, the local authorities' response would be, well, we can't have more allocations because that's going to go into areas where we've got a strong reason to refuse, whether that's green belt or flood risk or otherwise. So in reality, this clause, I'm not sure really what it's going to do in practical terms, because a local authority can't say, well, we can't meet our objectively assessed need because it's going to mean we're going to go into too much density. As again, the pushback will be have more allocations, in which case you're back to arguing what local plans are examined against now, which is, well, you can't have more allocations because of X, Y, Z, the green belt or otherwise. So I'm not sure actually that's going to make a huge difference. And just, does anyone take a different view? Does anyone read that clause and think it's going to make a big sea change as to how local plans go through? I've seen a hand up from Juliet. Juliet, I don't know whether you want to, in the chat function, make your points, but it doesn't appear that anyone takes a hugely contrary view, which is interesting. So the next point is that the NPPF is also saying that past over delivery in terms of number of homes permitted compared to the housing requirement in the existing plan, in which case over delivery may be deducted from the provision required in the plan area. Now, over delivery is something a little bit close to my heart because I did a judgment, a case that went to the High Court, which was Tewkesbury Borough Council challenging the Secretary of State. I'd been at an appeal in Tewkesbury, and we argued that the council, they'd over-delivered in previous years, and the council saying they should be allowed to rely on that to reduce their housing requirement going forward. We argued against that, and the inspector sided with us. That went to the High Court, and Mr. Justice Dove, in giving judgment, agreed with the inspector and effectively said that it's not an issue for the courts, that planning policy doesn't tell you what the answer is with over delivery, and therefore in the absence of planning policy giving a view, it's up to the planning judgment of the inspector, and she was entitled to form a view. Now, it's fair to say there's inspector's decisions going either way on that question of over delivery in the absence of any planning policy. The government now, through this NPPF revision, are putting in policies. So it's that past over delivery can be a reason for not meeting your objectively assessed housing need going forward. In short order, because you've done very well in your delivery for the past few years, that means you don't have to do as well for the next few years. And this clause will recognise that. I can see that we've got a few people in the chat. Oh, there's quite a few people. Yeah, so Matthew, we've got neighbourhood plans and local plans being politically driven and seeking low densities and design docs. Well, this NPPF does give credence to that. And is there any significance in the removal of the or under 11B1? That's from Jason. I think the reason why the or has been removed is it's just been displaced down to here, Jason. So I don't think it's simply because there's been a new clause put in just to make it grammatically correct. So I don't think there's anything to that. But thanks for the question. And I can see Claire, is this aimed at urban authorities who want to resist taller buildings on their few available sites? I mean, it possibly, Claire, but the reality is this NPPF will apply to all plans, and it will be open to any authority to say we can't meet our objectively assessed need because we don't have the densities for it. And again, the pushback will be, well, then get more sites, to which you'll go back into the classic argument about why you can't have more sites. So this argument density, I mean, a local authority could run that argument today, and I think they'd run into the same arguments, which is get more sites if you don't have the densities. Laura, that clause could, with clause A, allow councils to argue that they cannot meet their housing need, which I think several could, given political views. Yeah, well, they cannot. They can try and rely on it, but at risk of going in circles, I just can't see how the developer response will naturally be, well, then you need more allocations, to which we're going back into the same old arguments that we run now. So I don't see in practical terms how it's going to make that much of a difference. And over delivery in what time period, though, from Christine? That's a really good question, Christine. And we'll see that later on in the NPPF, that we're told that it's through the planning practice guidance, we'll be told more about over delivery. So as we sit here today, we don't know, but we are told that the planning practice guidance will give us the answer to that. And we'll see that in paragraph 75 of the framework as we go forward. And Jason, that the need for higher density and best use of land. Yeah, I agree with that. And Russell, hi Russell, how will over deliver in terms of housing land supply calculations as per your appeal? How does it work for the plan making? Surely the standard method provides a ground zero to move forward from. Well, that's the really interesting point, Russell, that what is being proposed with the over delivery provision is, say your housing requirements applying the standard method was, to keep it simple, 100 units per annum. So you'd apply that over the 5 years. So or for the plan making period, you might say, well, we'll apply that over the next 15 years. So you need to therefore reach 1,500 homes. In this hypothetical world, it's a very small local authority. You need to deliver 1,500 homes over the next 15 years. Well, if over the last few years, the council have been delivering, say, 200 per annum, the council would say, well, because we've over-delivered for the last 3 years, say, we've over-delivered by 300. So therefore, we don't need to deliver 1,500 homes over the next 15 years. We need to deliver 1,200 because we've over-delivered by 300. So I think that's what's being proposed. But the planning practice guidance will give a bit more meat on the bone. But that's the way in which, one way in which governments can get around having to deliver the local housing need going forward. And Steve B, this could mean that with Greenbelt release could result in OANs not being met. Oh, yes, absolutely right. I mean, that is the point, that the objectively assessed need, the local housing need, doesn't have to be met in circumstances where there are restrictions, Greenbelt being one, and we'll see how the government have made that point. Okay, I'm going to move back to the slide and move on to the next point, which is how it's dealt with for decision taking. So you'll note that none of the text in terms of the tilted balance is changed at all, but the footnotes are changed. And what the footnotes tell us, and we need to read this in tandem with paragraph 75 and also relating to the housing delivery test. I'll come on to housing delivery test in a moment, but just starting with arguing that the council do not have a 5-year housing land supply. So footnote 9 tells us that the tilted balance in paragraph 11D, Roman numeral 2, that applies for applications involving the provision of housing in situations where the local authority can demonstrate a 5-year supply, cannot demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, and the housing requirement set out in strategic policies is more than 5 years old, unless these strategic policies have been reviewed and found to not require updating. Goes on to talk about the housing delivery test. We'll come back to that. But just dealing with that first clause, that needs to be read in tandem with paragraph 75. But in short, what this clause does is it means that where a local authority have had their local plan adopted, and that local plan includes a housing requirement in the strategic policy, then for the first 5 years, the local authority don't need to demonstrate a 5-year supply. It's not open to a decision maker to say that the consequence of not having a 5-year supply engages the tilted balance. And my headline at the outset was that this new NPPF gives huge incentives to local authorities to get a plan in place. And we can see that specifically here, that if you get a plan in place, it means that the tilted balance is not engaged for that first 5-year period. And in the consultation document that accompanies the NPPF proposed changes, this is what the government say, this text here, that where local authorities have up-to-date plans which are delivering as expected, they should not be forced to expend resources defending against speculative applications that run counter to the plans agreed in consultation with communities. So this is very deliberately intended to say to local authorities, if you get your plan in place, you effectively get a 5-year grace period, during which time it's not open to decision makers to challenge that and say that the tilted balance is engaged. That's a little bit of the bombshell. And it said that it's for the first 5 years, unless these strategic policies have been reviewed. Now, where I think the government need to provide clarity is what is meant by the word reviewed. Because a review, we all know that there's the formal local plan review that would go to the Secretary of State and would be subject to an examination. But reviewed for the purposes of the framework could be, and this is where we need guidance, I think, could be that we simply take an officer report to the local planning authority planning committee that says that these policies don't need updating. We've reviewed them, we think they're fine, they don't need to be updated. And if you did that, the consequence would be that the tilted balance would continue to not be applied, because the developer would say, well, your plan is more than 5 years old and therefore it needs a review. Local authority say, well, we've done the review. We think it doesn't require updating, and therefore the tilted balance isn't engaged. And that question of what constitutes a review, that's, I think, where there'll be a huge scope for debate going forward, because if the local authority do the review as they purport to do it, it can mean they don't have to demonstrate a 5-year supply. I can see the chat functions getting lots of people are getting excited. So let me work through some of those points. Mike Ashworth, as there is no standard procedure for the plan review, councils can determine without examining the plan is up to date and has been reviewed, thus protecting their position, perhaps incorrectly. Yeah, exactly right, Mike. That's exactly my point, that there needs to be some meat on the bone as to what a review is, because in the absence of a procedure, it can be as light of a touch as take a report to the planning committee that says we don't need to update. And if they did that, the local authority, if they don't have the tilted balance isn't engaged. So obviously, given it's so critical as to whether the tilted balance is engaged, I think that's where we need some insight into what a review constitutes. And this is for me as a lawyer, whether you think these changes are good or bad, I think that level of ambiguity about what constitutes a review is unhelpful to everyone, both local authorities, developers, or otherwise. So who decides that the plan has been found not to be updating? That's from Jason. If it's the council, that doesn't seem transparent. Well, that's again, Jason, yeah, good point. Consistent with my issue, which is that it's not clear as to who makes that determination. But given it's not clear, it could be as low of a threshold as the planning committee. If the government, so Alan, if the government is going to go down the 5-year plan route to avoid speculative development, needs to be a greater scrutiny of site deliverability at plan making examination stage, as would be the case during a Section 78 appeal where the 5-year housing land supply is challenged. I agree with that in principle, Alan, which is that if there's going to be such reliance on local plans for housing delivery, so for the 5 years after their adoption, there's no real question. It's just assumed that they're delivering on 5-year housing land supply. Then you'd want there to be more scrutiny. Will there be? I doubt it. And we'll come on to the plan making stages and what needs to be shown. But if anything, there's a dilution of the requirements rather than a firming up of them. And Reese has asked, when referring to a plan being more than 5 years old, how will that work in practice where a local planning authority take a part one and part two approach? Really good question. The answer to that is, does the most recent plan contain a housing requirement? So if I go back to it, and footnote 9 needs to be read in conjunction with paragraph 75 of the framework, which we'll come on to. But it says that the housing requirements set out in strategic policies more than 5 years old. So if you've got a part two local plan, if you've got a part one plan, and that's your housing requirement policies, and then you've got a part two plan, which is your allocations, doesn't change the housing requirement, but it works to the housing requirement set out in part one, but your part two is just your allocations, then technically the part two wouldn't reset the clock in that 5 year period, because that would not include housing requirements set out in strategic policies. So your part two local plan wouldn't change that 5 year period. The 5 years would be counted from the part one plan. I hope that answers that question. Kim, interesting to know what this means for policy monitoring in local authorities. Yeah, there is a bit about monitoring at paragraph 75, Kim, which we'll come on to in a moment. And Vicky, if there is a significant housing shortfall at the point of review, then surely this points to the need for review. Yes, that makes sense, Vicky, but if the local planning authority take a report to their planning committee that says, notwithstanding the shortfall, we think the policies are still effective at delivering growth, and in our planning judgment, we do not think they require updating. If they said that, it would then be a question for the courts as to whether that's legally deficient. And I can see a judge saying, well, I can't say that it's not a review because what constitutes a review isn't dictated by policy. So maybe that is. And then Mark talks about the subcomponents of housing. Care nursing is a growing need nationally. Will you be able to run a tilted balance case? Really good question, Mark. And we'll come on to that point shortly, because there is some talk in this NPPF about the need for older people and some firming up of that language. So I'll come on to that in a moment. I've talked about the tilted balance there. And again, folks, I'm going to work through it and I will endeavour to deal with all the questions as well at the end, but it's really helpful to have them come through as we go. I dealt with the need to have a 5 year supply and the review point. The next point is talking about the housing delivery test. And again, we need to look at later paragraphs in the NPPF proposed that deal with the housing delivery test. So we'll come back onto housing delivery test when we look at paragraph 77 and 78. The next point, paragraph 14, which relates to neighbourhood plans, that the neighbourhood plan, it tells you that if you're contrary to a neighbourhood plan, that is likely to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits provided the following apply. And it changes these requirements. It removes C and D. So C was classically that the local authority needed to demonstrate a 3 year supply. Instead, it means that if you've got a neighbourhood plan that has allocations and policies to meet an identified housing requirement, then the 5 year period is afforded to the neighbourhood plan, which means you could have a local plan which goes 5 years old, and let's assume there's no review. So at the end of 5 years, and the local authority, let's assume they can't demonstrate a 5 year supply, the tilted balance would be engaged. But if you've got a neighbourhood plan, which has been adopted, let's say, a year before, then the neighbourhood plan would mean that that 5 year protection is effectively carried forward through the neighbourhood plan, because technically the tilted balance may be engaged, but this policy is telling you, well, any harm is likely to significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits. It's effectively telling a decision maker, don't be granting planning permissions contrary to a neighbourhood plan if the neighbourhood plan has been adopted within the last 5 years. So it's a strong protection, which again is consistent with the headline feature of what this new NPPF is trying to do, which is to get plans in place by giving these huge policy protections if they can be put in place, that they're effectively shielded for 5 years. Let's see if there's any outrage to that. So Tim's talked about paragraph 75 and 76 and talking about the review and the expectation. Tim, we'll come on to that when we turn to paragraph 75, which we will do that now because some of the other paragraphs are unrelated to this housing test. So let's move forward. to paragraph 75 and the housing delivery test as well later. So in terms of paragraph 75, it tells us that local authorities should monitor their deliverable land supply against the housing requirement as set out in strategic policies. So pausing there, the footnote talks about traveller sites, but the need to monitor applies to all sites in terms of the housing requirements. So for the first 5 years, local planning authorities still need to monitor the deliverable land supply, but it doesn't have the consequence of engaging the tilted balance. Now, let's assume, for argument's sake, that a local planning authority adopted a development plan and they're 3 years in from its adoption. They're monitoring it as they were expected to, and the monitoring shows that something's gone wrong and they don't have a 5-year supply. Now, it doesn't have the implications of engaging the tilted balance, because we see that from paragraph 11 and footnote 9, but that would be a material consideration. That would be that the decision maker would have to have regard for. So it's not, I can see that 5-year supply arguments might still persist, but developers wouldn't have the force of the tilted balance. They would simply be housing need is a material consideration rather than engaging the tilted balance. The next point, though, is that when the housing requirement set out in strategic policies becomes more than 5 years old, local planning authorities should identify and update annually a supply of specific deliverable sites sufficient to provide a minimum of 5 years worth of housing against their local housing need, taking into account previous under or oversupply as set out in planning practice guidance. Right, a lot there to unpick. The first point is that after 5 years, unless the strategic policies have been reviewed and found not require updating, it tells us then, therefore, that as we discussed earlier, that the local housing need is the relevant figure, but taking into account previous under or oversupply as set out in the planning practice guidance. And we saw someone asked the question earlier about, well, how long do you have regard for the oversupply and undersupply? We don't know. And that's what the planning practice guidance will hopefully come in and give us clarity. But the PPG, as things stand, doesn't give us any of the insight into how that's meant to function. Now, I think it's Tim, you made the point that the review, that paragraph 75, it gave the expectation that the review has to go before the Secretary of State. I confess, I don't see that in the language of paragraphs 75, 76. And that's rather my issue with this review point, that it's uncertain as to what constitutes a review. Again, is it a report to the planning committee? Is it something that goes before the Secretary of State and requires a formal examination? We don't know. And that's where I think the government need to come in and provide that clarity, because it just says have been reviewed and found to not require updating. Who does that review? Who needs to make that assessment about if we're not given the insight? So unless I'm missing something, so Tim tells us it's paragraph 76B. Yeah, that 76B. Thanks, Tim. Let me share my screen. I don't think that gives us the answer. 76B is dealing with an annual position statement. So it's a 5-year housing land supply, can be demonstrated where it has been established through an annual position statement, which incorporates the recommendation of the Secretary of State. Now, that's absolutely fine, but an annual position statement is a very different beast. This was an annual position statement was introduced a few years ago. The uptake for them has been relatively low. What it gives the local planning authority is an opportunity, if they want, to confirm that they do have a 5-year housing land supply. Very few authorities, to my knowledge, have actually done annual position statements because it's just more work. But when you're doing that has to go to the recommendation of the Secretary of State. But the review, for the purposes of the 5-year supply assessment, there's nothing in policy that, to my mind, gives us any insight that that's what's required. Again, that's my issue with it. So the next point on housing delivery test, which I've teased, is that the housing delivery test, it tells us that where the housing delivery test indicates that delivery has fallen below the following policy consequences should apply. So where that housing delivery test indicates that they're below 95% of the requirement of the previous 3 years, they should have an action plan. And where it's below 75% of the requirement of the previous 3 years, it engages the presumption in favour of sustainable development. But footnote 49 tells us that that doesn't apply if permissions have been granted for homes in excess of 150% of the authority's housing requirement over the applicable period. And in the consultation document, they refer to this as the switch off. Paragraph 20 of the consultation document tells us that this is meant to be this, this will switch off the application of the presumption as a consequence of under-delivery, where a local planning authority can demonstrate that there are sufficient deliverable permissions to meet the housing requirements set out in the local plan. Now, here's an interesting, so ultimately, even if the council haven't delivered over the past 3 years, they've fallen below 75% of what they were meant to be doing. If they had granted enough permissions such that they exceed 115% of their housing requirement over that period, then this housing delivery test doesn't engage the presumption in favour of sustainable development. The legal question for me, which I think is interesting, is the expectation is simply that the local authority have granted planning permissions which would have delivered collectively X amount of homes. If X is more than 115% of their requirement, then presumption doesn't apply. What if you have a large SUE, which there's a section 73 on it? So there's an original planning permission, let's say it's for 1,000 units. Developer comes across an issue, they realize they need to make a variation, so they put in a section 73 application to vary a planning condition. The council grant that permission, so they get a new freestanding planning permission, which again would be for 1,000 units, but with a different condition. Now, in that circumstance, there's two permissions, each for 1,000 units. It's the same site, so that site can only deliver 1,000 units. But as far as the housing delivery test is concerned, it's whether you've granted permissions. So the total figure in terms of permissions granted in that situation would be 2,000 units. Now, I think that would be a really interesting case to go before the courts as to how the housing delivery test applies in those circumstances, because on its face value, the local authority have granted permissions. And that's a very realistic scenario where you've got a section 73. So there's actually multiple permissions granted on one site, even though obviously only one of them is going to deliver. Let's see, go back to the questions. So is footnote 49 to address fears about land banking? Possibly. I mean, the Levelling Up Bill, good question, Kim. The Levelling Up Bill does propose to try and deal with slow build-outs. And there is talk in the consultation, not really related to these proposed changes to the NPPF, but talk about the need to be monitoring of large sites to understand why sites haven't been delivering as much as they have. So this possibly feeds into that narrative. Leases come and say that local authority could grant 115% of the local plan requirement and switch off the presumption in favour, even where there may be delays to discharge of conditions, etc. That's exactly right. Yeah. So even if the delivery is bad, if the grant of permissions is good, then it disengages the presumption. David, what is the situation where an authority has recently adopted a local plan and within a month of adoption it declared a nutrient neutrality area, which precludes permissions within 5 years supply? Yeah, really good question and a very credible and realistic scenario. In that scenario, what would happen is that the local planning authority wouldn't need to demonstrate a 5 year supply, but it would be a material consideration that notwithstanding that, they've got no housing delivery. So the developer wouldn't be able to say, well, the tilted balance is engaged. What they would be able to say, by this means, but what they would be able to say is, but it's a material consideration that this local authority is not delivering anything because of nutrient neutrality. So it would go into the mix, but you wouldn't have the force of the tilted balance. Steve, does footnote 49 mean permissions only that are up to 150% of the housing requirements, or can one combine completions and permissions to add up to the 150%? Doesn't seem to say this. I think it's one or the other. Yeah, so what I mean by that is the completions, it's have you completed more than 75% of your housing requirement? Now, if you have, if you've gone below that, so you're at 74% on your completions, you then switch and think, well, how many permissions did we actually grant? And irrespective of whether they delivered at all, how many permissions? And if that, how many permissions adds up to 115% over the requirement, then it disengages the presumption. Jeremy, what constitutes granting for these purposes? Outline permission. There can be quite a delay. I think if it's a grant of an outline, I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be counted in this context. I can see your reasons why you think it shouldn't be, but it's the grant of planning permission, whether it's an outline or full. Martin, hi Martin. Does the housing delivery test turn off the presumption for a housing scheme, even if the tilted balance is engaged for other reasons? Yeah, really good question. The housing delivery test and the tilted balance through lack of 5-year supply are two completely separate ways to get the benefit of the tilted balance. So if the council don't have a 5-year housing land supply, in circumstances where their plan is more than 5 years old and it hasn't been reviewed, and there's a lot of caveats here, lawyers love this, but in those circumstances, you get the tilted balance, irrespective of what's happening with the housing delivery test. The council might have had a great past 3 years, but it still doesn't affect, and vice versa. The housing delivery test might give you the benefit of the tilted balance, even if the council have a really good onward supply. So they do have a 5-year supply, but in the last 3 years hasn't been looking good for them. So in answer to your question, no, one is unrelated to the other. Matthew, giving a permission doesn't mean houses are being delivered. That's the issue. Yeah, absolutely right. But this is giving an incentive to actually getting them delivered. And Vicky says that one needs to refer to the definition of being deliverable. Well, it's a good point, and you might want to make that point to the authors of this proposed consultation of the NPPF, but it's simply the grant of permissions, as I read the housing delivery test. Whether it's deliverable is not referenced in that point at all, which brings me back to my point, which is you could have two permissions, your original and your section 73, that could deliver 2,000 units collectively. Both of them are permissions for houses, so that could get you above your 115%, because only one of them is going to be deliverable, but there's no test for deliverability. Okay, I'm going to move on, folks, and go back a step. So we've talked about the housing delivery test and the tilted balance. The next point I'd like to talk to you about, we get to paragraph 20, where we get our first reference to beauty. Now, beauty makes its way into an awful lot of places in this new NPPF. I've seen lots of design witnesses reel at this introduction on the view that it's not really clear what is beautiful is subjective, but there's an emphasis on this. How much impact this has on schemes going forward? Well, if it was a bad design yesterday, it's going to be a bad design today. And I don't know that the introduction of the word beauty into the new NPPF is going to change that. However, what one could say is that there's a greater emphasis on design being of paramount importance. The next change I'm going to talk about is in relating to examining of plans and the changes as to what one needs to do with a plan examination. So it tells us that plans are sound if they are positively prepared, effective and consistent with national policy. And you'll note that the proposal is to remove the word justified. It tells us that justified, which is an appropriate strategy, take into account the reasonable alternatives and based on proportionate evidence. Now, what we're told in the text that accompanies this, that the reason for this is we propose to simplify and amend the test of soundness through which plans are examined so that they no longer require to be justified. But it does go on to say, but they need to satisfy the requirements for environmental assessment. Now, in practical terms, what this means, the removal of the word justified, it is difficult to know because, as I'm sure all of you know, there are in large part two central questions in every examination. One, has the plan met the legal requirements? And two, is the plan sound? Two separate questions. And in terms of determining whether the legal requirements have been met, the need to do sustainability, strategic environmental assessment has not gone. And I double checked that today to make sure that's the case. And what we see in terms of the legal requirements, which will still apply, we see this from Regulation 12, other environmental impact, environmental assessment of plans and programs regulations, which is that they still need to be accompanied by an environmental assessment report, which will need to evaluate the likely significant effects on the environment of reasonable alternatives, taking into account the objectives and the geographical scope of the plan or program. So for the purposes of the legal requirements, there's still the need to look at reasonable alternatives, but in terms of the soundness test, you don't need to look at reasonable alternatives. So ultimately, if there's still a legal requirement that you've satisfied yourself that you've considered reasonable alternatives, the fact it's removed from the test for soundness, I'm not sure how much difference that's going to make. Ultimately, the intention is to make plans more straightforward. Does it? If there's still a legal requirement to look at reasonable alternatives, if it's not in the test for soundness, it's still a test to be met. So I'm not sure whether that's actually going to have any direct consequences on how plans go forward now. And then the next point that they change in terms of positively prepared, the language is provide a strategy which, so far as possible, is intended to meet your objectively assessed needs, whereas previously it was as a minimum. Now, there is a lot of the reaction. I've been reading lots of people's posts online about this new NPPF to try to gauge the reaction to people. A lot of people see this as a dilution of the need to meet your objectively assessed needs. As I see it, I don't think it moves the goalposts that much. It's perhaps a softening of language, but in practical terms, I'm not convinced it's going to make that much of a difference. And we'll see that when we come on to paragraph 61 in a moment. But just before I do that, I'm going to stop and just look at what people have said. So Kieran has asked, any headline ramifications for the use of Section 106 and SIL in the NPPF? I'm told the local planning authority want to be able to evidence that Section 106 SIL can still produce better housing outcomes. No changes that I can see, Kieran, in terms of how SIL and conditions are going to be used. Chrissy, in plan making, paragraph 11, referring to taking account of oversupply of planning permissions rather than delivery completions on the ground, could that take account of permissions that given but expired? Yes. In terms of housing delivery test, that's just purely have the local planning authority granted permissions in the last 3 years. But in terms of over delivery, no, that would need to be you've actually completed on the ground. And not that you granted, but it's how many houses have you actually delivered? And if you've done well, the local authority in the last few years, it means there's less of a need to do well over the next few years. So there's a relaxation of the requirement. James tells us beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Such a vague term, absolutely. As a lawyer, we hate words like that because it's impossible to know really how you use it in any meaningful sense. Connor, is the function of 35B retained elsewhere? Are the implications of the need for sustainability appraisal if not? Yeah, really good point, Connor, which hopefully I've gone through that. Yes, sustainability appraisal, you've still got to do your reasonable alternatives. So removing it from the test for soundness, what difference does it really make? Do not appear to be transitional arrangements for plans at an advanced stage to exempt them from the proposed changes to the NPPF. There is something on transitional arrangements, which, Paul, thanks. We will come on to that. It's near the very end of the NPPF. And there's also some text on transitional arrangements on 5-year supply. Claire, next point, is preparing SEAs to be replaced by environmental outcome reports. Next consultation on the horizon. Possibly. I'm going to take it one consultation exercise at a time. Michael, is the change to 35A not inconsistent with 11B, which previously had the same wording as 35A, but has not been changed? No. I'm going to come on to that in a moment, Michael, when we talk about paragraph 61, because I don't think there's been as much of a sea change in what local plans have to do as others do, save for in respect to Greenbelt. But in other respects, I don't think there's that much of a sea change. And Phil talks about, he's responding to Connor. And then James, the removal of a test requiring the demonstration of a proportionate evidence base seems bizarre. They don't remove the test for proportionate. They just remove for it to be justified. And the real point on justified is alternatives. But again, at the risk of repeating myself, there's still a need to look at reasonable alternatives for your sustainability appraisal. So removing it from the test for soundness, what difference will it really make in reality? Okay, the next, I'm going to move on, folks, and talk about paragraph 61. Now, this tells us, this is the softening of the language, but query, does it really make that much of a difference? So at the moment, what a local authority are meant to do for the purposes of the new local plan is that they need to work to what the local housing need tells them. That's the starting point. But then they need to apply exceptional circumstances to justify a deviation. Those exceptional circumstances could be that they're a constrained authority. See Greenbelt. Paragraph 11 tells us it could be that they can't increase the densities because it's going to be out of character. Look at our design codes. Or that they've done well in terms of passed over delivery, so they don't need to do as well going forward. I don't really see that this language changes that in practical terms. There's perhaps a softening by telling us that the standard method is an advisory starting point, but in reality, that is the situation now, that this PPG tells us the standard method is not the end of the process. It's where you start out. So I don't see that the requirement has materially changed through this language. At best, I'd say that this is a clarification of what the position is now, which is if you're a local authority and you're going into your examination and you're not proposing to meet your local housing need, you've got to provide a good reason for that, because you need to convince an inspector those exceptional circumstances apply. This language isn't going to change that. So I don't see this as being that seismic as many others do. I'm going to stop there to see whether I'm going to be told by everyone that I'm wrong. So far, no, it doesn't appear that there's outrage to that, or hasn't been a mass exodus where everyone's leaving the webinar either. The next point, you can see the standard method also imposes an uplift for urban local authorities in the top 20 most populated cities and urban centres. And in terms of talking about uplifts, it's interesting to note that paragraph 75 of the NPPF has removed the need for a buffer. So in terms of your local housing need, as we sit here today, determining our local housing need, we would figure out what is the local housing need annual requirement figure, and we would then apply that over 5 years, and then we'd add a buffer depending on whether it's 5, 10 or 5% for if you're in a 5-year supply context. That's gone. So that just reduces the need for local authorities to meet their housing need. It's softening of the requirements, because necessarily if you remove the buffer and the uplift, it's going to be a lower figure. The next point, in terms of paragraph 63. So this tells us that the local authority need to establish the need, and then they should be assessing and reflecting in planning policies the needs for various groups, including older people, which we're told is including for retirement housing, housing with care, and care homes. The consultation document that accompanies this, there's a real emphasis on need for older people. It tells us that by 2041, 1 in 4 adults in the UK will be over the age of 65, which is quite a staggering statistic when you think about it. So it acknowledges there's a real need to get on with delivering C2 and specialist accommodation. And there was a question about, well, can you get the benefit of the tilted balance for older people? Arguably, yes. I've been involved in an appeal where we successfully argued that the tilted balance was engaged, because we said that even though the council had a 5-year housing land supply, we said that the council's development plan policies had not assessed and reflected the needs for older people. So necessarily the requirements of what was paragraph 61 of the framework, now paragraph 63 in the draft version, hadn't been met. And the inspector agreed with that and engaged the tilted balance as a consequence. So you can still argue that the tilted balance applies. You just can't argue it applies because the council don't have a 5-year housing land supply. It's still open to you to argue it. Karen says, could you get tilted balance for self-build? Arguably, yes. Arguably, yes. So again, similar situation. If we're in paragraph 63, so that tells us that the local planning authority need to be able to provide for people wishing to commission or build their own home, and they need to establish that need, and that should be assessed and reflected in planning policies. Now, arguably, if the local planning authority haven't reflected the need for self-build, then arguably they haven't met the requirements of paragraph 63, and their policies might then be considered out of date. And that could be a reason to get into the tilted balance, irrespective of housing delivery test, irrespective of 5-year supply. Just you'd say, well, on this particular issue, the development plan's out of date because it doesn't reflect what the development plan was needed to do in terms of self-build. William says, how will we be able to engage the tilted balance for C2? I hope I've dealt with that point. Again, if they haven't, local planning authority haven't got, they haven't reflected and assessed the need for C2, then arguably, then they haven't complied with what will be paragraph 63 of the framework. Graham, hi Graham, are there any penalties for local authority not having carried out or kept up to date any relevant assessment of need? There's no penalty, except for you to argue that they haven't complied with paragraph 63, and therefore the tilted balance is engaged, but there's no penalty beyond that. Christian, send me an email about that. I'll be able to fashion you with that. It's at kgarvey@kingschambers.com. If you send me an email, and I'll ping you over the appeal decision. Okay, next point to talk about. We move on to mansards, I believe. Yeah, there's a number of changes which I'm not going to talk about because a lot of them are, as I said, quite inconsequential. But one that just to be aware of in terms of, it tells us planning decisions should support opportunities to use the airspace above existing residential commercial premises, which is existing policy. And it goes on to say that this should be to allow mansard roof extensions where their external appearance harmonise with the original building. So there's a development in favour of mansards. I'm not sure what to take from that. The next point, paragraph 137, local planning authority should ensure that relevant planning conditions refer to clear and accurate plans and drawings, which provide visual clarity about the design of the development and are clear about the approved use of the materials where appropriate to make enforcement easier. Now, I'd say that would be a good idea, irrespective of whether it's a paragraph in the NPPF. And indeed, I've been involved in enforcement scenarios where the planning conditions are pretty opaque about what materials are and are not required. So I think that's good advice in any event, but the fact that it's being put into the NPPF as policy perhaps wasn't needed. But I think what flows from that is it's, again, supporting this notion of beauty and design being of paramount importance. And I note that that's in section 12, which has now added achieve well-designed and beautiful places. Again, shoehorning in the word beauty as much as they can. The next point to talk about, and this is on Greenbelt, and this is quite a significant one. So Chrissy, paragraph 61, saying that standard method is a starting point, housing need, and then moving towards working out housing requirement with reference to constraint. The bit about exceptional circumstances is a different point. It's saying there may be exceptional circumstances of using a different method to the standard method to work out the actual housing need figure, not an exceptional circumstance for working out a lower housing requirement figure. I think the PPG still tells us that the starting point is let's examine that point. So back to 61. Well, as I see it, if we read this sentence here, Chrissy, that there may be exceptional circumstances relating to particular characteristics of an authority which justify an alternative approach to assessing housing need, in which case the alternative used should reflect current and future demographic trends and market signals. Well, as I read that, it's telling us that the standard method is what the housing need is, but you can exceptionally try and use a different method for assessing what housing need is. But in terms of deviating from what the standard method tells you, in terms of it being an advisory starting point, well, we still have the PPG, which tells us you need to provide a good justification and exceptional circumstances for deviating from that. And indeed, the chief planner
was on the Have We Got Planning News for You, which is a YouTube show I'm sure many of you have seen, and she confirmed that that's still what's intended to be the case going forward with the new NPPF, that still local authorities will need to provide a very good reason for just deviating from the standard method. So again, I don't think it's as much of a sea change as some have feared in that respect. But as ever, we'll see when we get more guidance in the planning practice guidance. I see. Thanks, Jill. So going on, we're going to move to paragraph 142. Yeah, talking about Greenbelt. Now, this is an important one, which tells us that Greenbelt boundaries are not required to be reviewed and altered if this were to be the only means of meeting the objectively assessed need for housing over the planned period, which is effectively telling you that if the reason why you cannot meet your objectively assessed need is because of the Greenbelt, well, then that's not a good reason to justify reviewing the Greenbelt. So to my mind, this is telling local authorities that they don't need to be reviewing their Greenbelt boundaries if that is the only means of getting to their housing requirement. So it gives them a pretty good defense, to my mind, as to say, well, we're not going to go into the Greenbelt. Whether that's a good or bad idea or an ugly idea, I'll leave to others to take a view on. But to my mind, it gives a greater strength to and force to local authorities saying we're not going to go into the Greenbelt in our local plan. The next point, which I'm going to touch on briefly, which is to do with renewables and low carbon energy, that there's a greater emphasis on the need for repowering and maintenance and the policies that support life extensions of existing renewable sites. And it tells us that we start with a baseline of what's currently already there. So again, just trying to have more renewable energy and more use of existing sites. And then the final point I'm going to talk about, just before I do, I can see a few people have chimed in on respect to Greenbelt. So Richard, does this now mean that local planning authorities with Greenbelt need not to release land for housing simply to achieve its housing requirement or assist with joining cities with large uplift? That's my reading of it. That's what paragraph 142 to my mind does, because it's telling us that once established, Greenbelt boundaries should only be altered where exceptional circumstances are fully evidenced and justified through the preparation of updating the plans. Now, it doesn't define what exceptional circumstances are, but Greenbelt boundaries are not required to be reviewed and altered if this would be the only means of meeting the objectively assessed need for housing over the planned period. So if you've got a heavily constrained authority, let's say, and no chance can they meet their housing need without going into the Greenbelt. So you would say, well, you need to go into your Greenbelt, therefore, to meet your objectively assessed need. Local authority, my reading of it, is to say, well, we're not required to. We don't need to review and alter the Greenbelt boundaries to meet that need. That's what 142 is telling us. So that's my reading of it, Richard. I'm sure there's many who are upset by that, but that's, to my mind, how it's meant to work. And Mark, you're right, it doesn't mention the MOL in London, but many planning policies in terms of metropolitan open land tell us that they are meant to be applied in the same context as Greenbelt policy, so wouldn't shock me. And Justin's come in and said that exact point, that local plan tells us that MOL should be treated as Greenbelt. So yeah, I think there will be a read over of one to the other. And Mike tells us, is the reality that if the requirement cannot be met without Greenbelt, is the requirement then reduced, or will they simply fall further behind the supply or housing delivery test requirement? I think it probably would be that the requirement would be lowered because it's the starting point. But paragraph 11 tells us they should, as a minimum, provide for objectively assessed need for housing and other users, as well as any other needs within other areas, unless the application of policy is protect, which would apply in terms of footnote 7 to Greenbelt. So yeah, so it would either be that they say, well, the requirement in the plan is lower, or you'd simply say that notwithstanding that requirement, we're not going to meet it. And there's an acknowledgement of that. But effectively, the Greenbelt is afforded protection, and it's going to be hard to argue exceptional circumstances are in themselves the need to meet the objectively assessed need. Jason, does that increase pressure to release other non-greenbelt designated land? Demonstrate need has been met as far as possible. Yes. I think undeniably that will be the case. And what about assessing the objectively assessed need for employment land in terms of paragraph 142? Most of these changes are directed towards housing in reality. So employment land, I think it makes that particular clause is only dealing with housing. So you could argue that you need to go into the greenbelt for your employment land, and that clause wouldn't change at all. And Stephen, so if it's an option to review the greenbelt, local planning authorities still can choose to, because it's not the only way of meeting need. But no, if not an option, they may have to review greenbelt in order to meet need. Then they can't review greenbelt. Well, I think you're quite right. It's an option, but the point is they're not required to. So that's not to say that a local authority won't do this, but they're not required to by virtue of paragraph 142. And Michael, you make the point, it's not prohibiting them. Absolutely right. But it gives them protection if they decide that they're not going to. And Andrew says this is the biggest shift of goalposts within the proposed NPPF changes. To my mind, the biggest shift across the NPPF is the 5-year protection afforded to local plans. That's the biggest protection as I see it. But say for that, you're probably right. This is probably the biggest. And Sam asks, if there is an acute shortfall in housing supply, can that still be an exceptional circumstance for an application? Well, in an application terms, you would be arguing very special circumstances. Yes, the very special circumstance test is not changed at all by virtue of the new NPPF, so you could still argue that. But I suspect a decision maker would look back on paragraph 142 and say, well, a need for housing isn't enough, because that's what 142 is really getting at. So they could still try and bring that in to weaken your argument on very special circumstances. Okay, and the final point I'm going to talk about with this NPPF, thanks for being so patient, folks, is the transitional arrangements. So someone asked earlier about what about plans that are currently going through the process in terms of examination. Paragraph 225 tells us whether these new tests for soundness will apply in respect to plans, and it's that it will apply to plans that have not reached regulation 19 stage, and 225 tells us all of the implications for when this will apply for the purpose of examination, and tells us that for other plans, the policies contained in the July 2021 will continue to apply. So that's going to be very specific depending on what local authority you're in. And then the next paragraph, 226, very interesting, which introduces a 4-year housing land supply requirement. So it gives a relaxation from the 5-year threshold down to 4 years in circumstances where the local authority have submitted a plan either for consultation. So if they're at regulation 18 consultation, so that plan's been subject to that regulation 18 consultation, and that regulation 18 consultation includes a policies map and proposed allocation towards meeting housing need, then the local authority only need to demonstrate a 4-year worth of housing land supply instead of a 5 years. So back to my headline that I set out at the beginning, it gives huge incentives to local authorities to get a new local plan, because once they go through the process of getting the examination done, they only need to demonstrate a 4-year supply. And once the plan's adopted, they're given a 5-year shield, effectively, from arguments about tilted balances and whatnot. So huge incentives there for local authorities to submit. The legal question is from the date of this publication of the NPPF. So if you've got a local authority who have just completed their Regulation 18 consultation, and in a few months' time, let's assume this is the version of the NPPF we're looking at, what does this do? My own view is I think that would automatically bring the local authority down to the 4 years worth of housing supply. But there is an argument to be made that it's only when the Regulation 18 consultation occurred after the date of publication. But that will be potentially, and that's not my view, but I can see an argument to that effect. So it might be that that's one for the courts in due course. So folks, that was everything I was going to go through. on this NPPF. Let me go look at the questions. Thanks everyone for sticking around for so long. Michael's asked, thinking back to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, the white paper, beauty differs from good design, delivering the required function in involving being well built in terms of materials, etc. Probably others I've forgotten too. You're absolutely right, Michael. It's so subjective what constitutes beauty. And I think the only thing we can really take from this, from a development management sort of decision-taking context, is there's more emphasis on design being important. But I don't think a good design yesterday is now a bad design, and vice versa. I don't think it changed that subjective lens. It's just there's more emphasis on it. And Stephen Snowden says that footnote 63 was an excellent chance to get away from the nonsense local authorities to designate areas for onshore wind, but they fudged it along with community approval issue as well. Well, I'm sure they might form the basis of your representation to the department to on the consultation. Remember, everyone, you still can get your views in and see whether they'll actually be heard. And Adam, what is the implication of these proposed changes on the levelling up agenda? I think this aligns with that agenda, and the consultation does tell us, the paper that accompanies this does tell us that this is part and parcel of that levelling up agenda. But that levelling up agenda is a long-term plan, which the government set out what all the steps are up to 2031. So it's a very long-term plan, this agenda. But this is a precursor to further changes in the NPPF. The government recognise once the levelling up bill comes in and we move to sort of national development management policies, we'll need a new NPPF. So this is a stepping stone, but if this is the new version, it will obviously be with us for a while. Jason, sorry, Darren, I've skipped over you. Do you see any means on circumnavigating Greenbelt release for non-supply of housing targets? I'm not sure I follow your question. Sorry, Darren. It's probably me being slow. And do you think neighbourhood plans will essentially block a raft of housing proposals even where targets are not met? Well, yes. If you've got a neighbourhood plan that includes allocations, for 5 years after its adoption, it's telling you that the tilted balance, even if it's engaged, that should not significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits. So yes, a neighbourhood plan will be a very high hurdle to overcome if you're contrary to it for the first 5 years. Jason, is there anything in levelling up that gives support to the headlines suggesting Gove has done away with house building targets? No, not that I've seen. I know in the House of Lords there was some the government were being mocked because of what was considered to be a dilution of housing requirements. Said I don't see it as much of a sea change as others. It's a softening of the language for sure, but I don't think it's that much of a sea change in terms of house building targets as others do. But the big caveat is we'd have to wait to see what the PPG says. And I should say the housing targets are lower because we've removed the things like buffers, but there's still a need for local plans to try and meet housing needs. Local authorities will be doing what they're doing now, and they'll be arguing why if they can't meet those housing needs, why that's the case. Developers will be saying you should be. So I think a lot of the same arguments will be played out. Matthew, regardless of consultation responses that may object to some of these clauses, do you see the government making any real changes following consultation? My gut instinct is no. This will almost be word for word for what we've dealt with in a few months' time. I'll deal with that offline. Whether this is the version of the NPPF in a few months' time, we will see. But I'll pick the phone up to you, Matthew, on that one. And Justin, is there any idea when the updated NPPF will be published? They keep saying it will be immediately, and they say it will be from spring. So the consultation lasts until the 2nd of March. Then they'll need to be a bit of time for them to actually go through those consultation responses, make any changes if they are going to make any. So we could be seeing this sort of May, June time. Thomas, on paragraph 35, how easy it would be to supersede the Regulation 12 requirement that retain reasonable alternatives in order to remove it? As things stand, that is the law. So, I mean, you can change the law, but it's still there. So given it's still a legal requirement that reasonable alternatives have been considered for the purpose of a sustainability appraisal, not sure how much removing it from the test for soundness is going to make that much of a difference.
And how many local planning examinations have people been to where the examination inspector says at the outset, I don't want to hear about emission sites? So it's not as if that's a point that's new. And Patrick, do the transitional arrangements only apply protection in terms of housing land supply, or do they alter the application of paragraphs 49 and 50 in terms of prematurity? They don't. The test for prematurity remains exactly the same. Nick, how potentially significant is increased emphasis on agricultural land via footnote 67? Yeah, really good point. That's about biodiversity. Sorry, best and most versatile land. I don't think it's going to make. I didn't focus on that because I was conscious this was already going to be quite long. I don't see it's going to make a huge difference. It tells us the availability of where we've got significant development of agricultural land. The availability of agricultural land used for food production should be considered alongside the other policies in this framework when deciding what sites are most appropriate for development. I don't see a huge change to that personally, which is why I didn't focus on it. But others might take a different view. I'm just not sure there's much in that. How do you anticipate the Mole Valley local plan situation will play out in light of the request for all Greenbelt sites to be deleted from the emerging local plan via main modification? Mole Valley shall hear from the inspector seen any event, but interested to receive your views in light of the NPPF consultation. I don't think this new NPPF will make a whit of difference to Mole Valley local plan, to be honest. I don't see how an examination inspector today could have regard for what is draft policy in any meaningful sense. So I don't think that would be lawful. So I don't think it's going to make a difference. And Stephen, James Hunt, do you think these changes will push local authorities who have halted local plans to start to move forward again, or delay further until changes come into force? Good question. I think that they should, if I was a local authority, I mean, the incentive is to just get on with it. I suppose if you're a local authority and you are dealing with Greenbelt release and you suddenly realize, actually, we quite like to be examined against paragraph 142, you might consider delaying examination. But otherwise, I would imagine it wouldn't be. I wouldn't see too much sense in delaying unless you're really dealing with Greenbelt. And in that case, strategically, a local authority might take that view. Will I be doing a further Zoom after the 2nd of March? Well, it depends how much it changes, because if it's very similar to the version that we've got now, you've got my views. And Ryan, change to the Greenbelt text, clearly designed to shift judgment further to local level, but the implication not meeting housing needs seems likely to have a wider social and economic consequence. Seems likely that the latter will be where local authorities start to justify their exceptional circumstances for reviewing them, as opposed to housing. I can certainly see that point. And Oliver, is there a Greenbelt cited appeal? Assume the new NPPF is adopted based on very special circumstances, and the authorities plan at least a regulation of 18. I'm not aware of any, but I have no doubt that in the next few months we are going to be seeing how developers have to contend with, if this is the new NPPF, we'll have to contend with this. So undoubtedly, we're going to see a raft of appeal decisions and legal judgments dealing with these changes. And Chris, could a Greenbelt review for commercial purposes weaken the approach of not considering Greenbelt for housing? I don't see that this change to the NPPF will make much of a difference for if you've got a commercial scheme in the Greenbelt. These changes are directed towards housing. Okay, folks. Well, I've rattled on for a long time there. Hopefully I haven't bored you all. As I said, the recording will be available from about tomorrow. So if you email the King's Chambers Marketing, which hopefully you've got your email from, they'll be able to send you a copy of it. And if anyone's got they want to send any emails to me directly, it's kgarvey@kingschambers.com. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful. And enjoy the rest of your day.